Hello, welcome to another video podcast on neuroanatomy. In this podcast, we'll be talking about some of the important sulci and gyri which are present on the inferior surface of the cerebral cortex. And some of these sulci are going to be continuing from the medial surface and then projecting onto the inferior surface. So we'll talk about that continuity as well. Let's orientate as a first step. Let's orientate the pictures of the prosections which we are able to see over here. So what we can see here is basically an illustration of the inferior view of the cerebral cortex, and you can probably appreciate the cut section of the brain stem over here. These are the temporal lobes. These are the frontal lobes. You're looking at them from the inferior surface. So these are the orbital surfaces of frontal lobe, and then you can see at the back end, this is the occipital lobe. This is a pro-sectional view of the brain from an inferior aspect. Once again, we can see the temporal lobes over here, and the back end of the brain is characterized by the cerebellum. And so if the cerebellum is intact, then obviously we cannot see the occipital lobe, but we can still see the frontal aspect of the brain over here. The inferior surfaces of the frontal lobe can be seen here, and so these are the orbital surfaces of frontal lobe, and we'll talk about those in a second. This is basically the medial view of the cerebral cortex, and you probably are familiar with this by now because we can see the corpus callosum and the lateral ventricle on the medial side. The medial surface is continuing down over here and merging with the inferior surface. So you can see the temporal lobe over here. This is again the occipital pole, and you can see several sulci which could potentially go from the medial surface onto the inferior surface. Cerebellum has been removed here, so we can see the inferior surface very clearly. Now, this with this background and orientation, we can start talking about some of the important sulci and gyri over here. So let's start with the sulcus, which is called the calcarine sulcus, which we did talk about a little bit in one of our previous video podcasts when we were talking about the cuneus and the lingual gyrus on the occipital on the medial surface of occipital lobe. Now we can see once again, if we look at the medial view over here, we can see the calcarine sulcus here. And if you guys remember, the calcarine sulcus was dividing the occipital lobe, this being the occipital lobe, it was dividing the occipital lobe into a lingual gyrus, into a cuneal gyrus at the top, also known as the cuneus, and into a lingual gyrus down below, also known as the lingula. Now, we're going to be the reason why we are talking about these over here is because if you look at this lingual gyrus, you can see that the lingual gyrus continues down on the inferior surface, and this continuation of the lingual gyrus, which continues till over here, is given different names in different places, right? We call it lingual gyrus when we see it on the medial view underneath the calcarine sulcus, but when it continues on to the inferior surface, then this becomes the parahippocampal gyrus, and the parahippocampal gyrus anteriorly can be seen to have a bumpy end to it. This in-turn bumpy ending is known as the uncus, right? So we've got lingual gyrus, we've got parahippocampal gyrus, and then we've got uncus over here. Now you can also see that now on the medial side we've got a sulcus here. This is known as the collateral sulcus, and if you continue the collateral sulcus anteriorly, it's anteriorly it's given a different name which is known as the rhinal sulcus. So in other words, the lingual gyrus over here is kind of sandwiched between the calcarine sulcus at the top and the collateral sulcus down below. And then if we follow the parahippocampal gyrus to the front, we can see that it is bounded laterally by the rhinal sulcus. Now the collateral and the rhinal sulcus, they separate the parahippocampal gyrus from another gyrus here which is known as the medial occipital temporal gyrus. If there is a medial occipitotemporal gyrus, then there has to be a lateral occipitotemporal gyrus as well, which is more laterally placed. And in between them, there is a sulcus called occipitotemporal sulcus, which is not really that clearly visible over here, but that sulcus divides the occipitotemporal gyrus into a medial occipitotemporal gyrus and lateral occipitotemporal gyrus. The lateral occipitotemporal gyrus then continues on to the supralateral surface, and it is basically continuing as the inferior temporal gyrus. So, I mean, the inferior temporal gyrus and the lateral occipitotemporal gyri basically are one entity. It's just like we're looking at them from two different views, and the inferior extension is known as the lateral occipitotemporal gyrus, and the supralateral extension, you can say, would be the inferior temporal gyrus. Right, so now we can see these gyri clearly over here in this illustration here as well. We're looking at the inferior surface and see we've got if we start from the lateral side, this is the occipitotemporal sulcus separating the medial occipitotemporal gyrus on the medial side and lateral occipitotemporal gyrus on the lateral side. And this, we said, is going to continue on the supralateral surface as inferior temporal gyrus. Then inner to the medial occipitotemporal gyrus, we've got collateral sulcus, which continues as the rhinal sulcus, and these two sulci are going to form the lateral boundary of the uncus and the parahippocampal gyrus. The parahippocampal gyrus, we said, is going to continue backwards onto the medial side as the lingual gyrus, right? If this is the lingual gyrus, then we can see a little bit of an extension of the cuneus continuing from the medial side coming onto the inferior surface. This is the cuneate gyrus, and these two guys are separated from each other. The cuneus is separated from the lingula by this extension of the calcarine sulcus, which is obviously going to be more prominent on the medial view, but a little bit of it extends down onto the inferior surface as well. Then, if you look, if we go to the front over here on the undersurface of frontal lobe, we can see a prominent sulcus here, which is known as the olfactory sulcus, which separates this big gyrus over here, which is known as the gyrus rectus. The gyrus rectus gets separated by the olfactory sulcus from these gyri. These are a group of gyri which are together known as the orbital gyri, and they're separated from each other by loads of orbital sulci. We can see that very nicely over here. We can see the olfactory sulcus. This olfactory sulcus is containing the olfactory nerve and the olfactory bulb, which is the first cranial nerve, and we'll talk about that later. So the olfactory sulcus hosts the olfactory nerve. Medial to it is the olfactory gyrus. You can see the same thing here as well: olfactory gyrus, olfactory sulcus containing the olfactory nerve. And then we can see loads of orbital sulci forming loads of orbital gyri. All of them are going to rest on the orbital plates of the frontal bone. Lastly, over here we can see the temporal lobe very nicely. We can see the temporal lobe it's covered over here by the arachnoid matter, and so the sulci might not be that prominent, but we can still figure out what the structures are. So you can see the anterior end of the parahippocampal gyrus, which kind of becomes really bumpy and kind of turns in like this to form what is known as the uncus, and the parahippocampal gyrus is then laterally bounded here by the rhinal sulcus. This is the same sulcus which, if we follow backward, is going to continue to form the collateral sulcus, but obviously we can't see that because cerebellum is obscuring our view. Then we can see the occipitotemporal sulcus, which we can follow all the way to the back as well. The occipitotemporal sulcus separates the medial occipitotemporal gyrus from the lateral occipitotemporal gyrus. That is really clearly visible. These sulci and gyri are very nicely shown here. The lateral occipitotemporal gyrus then continues on to the supralateral surface as the inferior temporal gyrus. So, to summarize, we basically talked about a few sulci and gyri on the medial and primarily on the inferior surface. We talked about the rhinal and the collateral sulci, and then we talked about occipitotemporal sulcus. Rhinal collateral sulci separated the parahippocampal gyrus and uncus from the lateral occipitotemporal gyrus. Occipitotemporal sulcus was separating the medial occipitotemporal gyrus from the lateral occipitotemporal gyrus, and the lateral occipitotemporal gyrus then continues on the lateral supralateral side as the inferior temporal gyrus, which we obviously can't see over here. We had an olfactory sulcus over here separating the gyrus rectus from the orbital gyri. The orbital gyri are created by loads of orbital sulci.